In this video, we're going to take a look at the global controls that are accessible in PXT-Live. Global controls are controls that function the same regardless of which mode you're in. We've done our best to try to keep these the same as possible to the global controls that are accessible in Push's default functionality. That way, there's not a whole bunch of stuff that you need to relearn. All right, in this image, you could see the layout of all the controls on the controller. The controls shown in green, as well as the upper two lines of the display, change depending on which encoder mode you're in. The controls in blue, as well as the lower two lines of the display, change depending on which matrix mode you're in. The rest of the controls on the controller are global. Starting on the left-hand side of the controller, foot switch 1 will launch the selected scene, foot switch 2 will launch the selected clip. The tap tempo button works just as it does by default, except that it also functions as a visual metronome. The metronome button works just as it does by default, as does the tempo encoder. The swing encoder has been repurposed. By default, it'll control global quantization. When shift is pressed, it'll control record quantization. The undo button works just as it does by default. The delete button is a modifier. It changes the functionality of other controls, and we'll look at that in future videos. The double button works just as it does by default. The quantize button works basically the same as it does by default. When the quantize button is pressed, you use the first three encoders to adjust quantization settings. The fixed length button works similar to how it does by default, except that when it's pressed, you use the swing encoder to adjust the recording length. The automation button works just as it does by default, as does the duplicate button. The new button works exactly as it does by default, except that it also has some additional functionality. When shift is pressed, it'll insert a MIDI clip into the selected clip slot, and when the session button is pressed, it'll insert an audio track that's routed from the currently selected track. That way you can record audio from the currently selected track. The record button has some additional functionality as well. When shift is pressed, it'll toggle arrangement record, and if you're in arrangement view, it'll toggle arrangement overdub. The play button works exactly as it does by default. The touch strip has been repurposed. It'll control the last parameter that was adjusted with the encoders, or the last parameter that was clicked on with your mouse. Shift plus the touch strip will reset the parameter that it's currently controlling back to its default value. The master encoder works just as it does by default. The master button works similar to how it does by default, except that if the master track is already selected, pressing the master button again will select the track that was previously selected. Shift plus the note button will toggle detail view on and off. Shift plus the session button will toggle between session and arrangement view. The arrow buttons will navigate around in session view. Shift plus the arrow buttons will navigate the grid selector to select the tracks and scenes you'll be controlling. In arrangement view, up and down will navigate tracks, and left and right will navigate the insert marker.